Hey guys, welcome to my first video on an introductory guide to electronics. This is kind of going along with my pinball design videos that I'm doing as well on this channel. So this is just going to give people who want a basic understanding of electronics so that they can diagnose faults in things like pinball machines or arcade machines or even old hi-fi amplifiers or anything like that. So this is going to be an introduction to some of the more basic components and a basic understanding of how electricity works and how these components works, so you can do some simple fault finding, because it's kind of becoming a bit of a lost art working on analog electronics as everything moves digital. But hopefully later on we'll cover some digital stuff as well. A little bit about me. I have worked in electronics now for 12 years or so, I guess. So I've done everything from electronics design. So I do things like PCB design. So here's some PCBs that I've designed for companies that this is for audio work actually. So these are audio compressors and microphone preamps. I've done repair work in the field of entertainment equipment, as well as hi-fi or pro audio, and I've also worked in consumer electronics, almost everything in my time. So I thought I'd share just the basics of what I know, and then as I'm doing the pinball videos as well, people can get an understanding of their pinball machines and how they work and how to fix those machines simply without having to pay really expensive money for technicians. So this video, these videos will probably cover everything from how electricity works through capacitors, resistors, inductors, solenoids, transformers, and then on to maybe a bit more advanced stuff as well with motors and maybe a bit of digital stuff in there as well, op amps, transistors, all that stuff. So this first video, I'm just going to introduce to what electricity is. So very simply put, to understand what electricity is, you need to understand what a basic atom is. So what you've got with an atom is, in the middle, you've got your nucleus, which contains your neutrons and protons, and then on the outside, you've got electrons. Now, you don't need to fully understand how this works, we're just giving a basic understanding of what electricity actually is. So, what happens in metals, and let's take a look at copper. So we have a copper atom right here, seeing that conducts electricity very well. The electrons are negatively charged and the protons are positively charged. So they're kind of attracting each other in. And as you can see with copper, we've got one little electron out here on its own in this like outer shell. And that means that this bond that this electron has to this atom is kind of weak. And it means this electron can kind of just float away if it really wants to. And it turns the atom into what we call an ion, because it's either missing or got extra electrons. Now, what happens when we pack a whole bunch of these copper atoms together is we get a whole shit ton of these outer electrons, valence electrons or whatever you want to call them, that can easily float around. And you get this sea of electrons just floating inside the copper. Now, there's plenty of atoms that can do this. Metals being the ones that have a more freely ability for their their electrons to just float around. So that's why I have metals. Other like non-metal atoms might have a complete outer shell of electrons, and they're all held in quite tightly, so the electrons don't want to float away. So what electricity simply is the flow of these free electrons, or flow of electrons. So what can happen is, say with static electricity, when you're rubbing two things together, is the electrons jump from one atom to the other. And then one atom has way too many electrons, and now the other atom doesn't have enough electrons. And now that's what we actually call voltage. Now, voltage is simply the difference between two items' amount of extra electrons, or there's more electrons over here and less electrons on the other side. So voltage is purely just the difference between one side's got too many electrons and the other side's not got enough. So on the battery, on one side of the terminal, there's heaps of extra electrons, and on the other terminal, there's not many electrons at all. So what happens when we connect them up is electrons try to balance themselves out. So when you short a battery, you get current. And current is purely just the simple flowing of these electrons. So the electrons are trying to flow from, oh, I've got way too many electrons, and he's just trying to pound down to the other side where there's not many electrons. And so current is just a measurement of the flow of electrons. So, and that is our electricity. And so, very simply, this flowing is energy per se, and so that is what turns into electricity. Now, it's not, you don't need to know how many electrons are flowing from one point to the other point, to create one thing, because very simply, there's been a lot of complex math done for us that this amount of electrons equals this much current, and this equals this voltage, because that's all being done, and you can very simply know that voltage is the difference between these electrons, and you can have 1 volt, 2 volt, 3 volt, 4 volt, and current is the flow of these electrons, and how many of them are passing a point at one singular point in time. So, very simply, that is what voltage is, what current is, what electricity is, very simply, and how those three are kind of interaction with each other, and I guess what an atom is. So yeah, that's the first video. In the next video, I'm going to look at resistance and what resistors are, and if I've got plenty of time, maybe capacitors and inductors as well. Hopefully, I don't actually have any pinball machines up here in Port Augusta as yet, so I'm on the hunt for a couple of project machines that I can use throughout these videos. So if anyone knows anyone in Australia that's got some cheap, maybe a DMD and a cheap EM floating around, Project One, I'll get some in here so we can do project work on those as well. So yeah, there we go. Thanks very much, guys.